Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. We've been lucky, again, we've had this gentleman a couple of times in here talking, and he's always got a story to tell. And let's put it, sometimes it gets a little up and...
Hey, the stories just keep getting better.
Yeah. All right, Chuck. Great. Nice having you with us.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. So my plan is to talk for about 45, 50 minutes, and then to have time for questions. This will all be done within an hour. So I just wanted to let you know that for a couple of reasons. One, if you just can't stand anymore and you have to leave, just leave. I won't be upset. The other is, although there's time for questions at the end, I do like to have questions in the middle too. Realize I'm talking about things I did in the late 70s and early 80s, so if it takes me a minute to remember, it just takes me a minute. But what I wanted to ask first of all while I'm sitting here is that I've given this presentation a lot of times, and very often, probably most of the time, there's people in the audience who have been part of the SR-71 mission. And so is there anybody here today that's part of had the opportunity to work on the strategic reconnaissance SR-71 mission? Well, there's fewer and fewer around as the plane retired a while ago. I would just also point out that if you came here to listen to an SR-71 pilot talk, I'm sorry, that's me up there. I'm the guy doing the air refueling, and so it's a little bit different perspective on the mission and the overall system that's required to do it. In other words, that guy doesn't get to take his pictures and do his spying unless this is working too. And so what I'm going to talk about today is, why we need this thing, what makes it unique, and why is it so unique that they had to modify tankers to be able to refuel it. And it's not just the fuel. So let's move on and just mention that there's a whole lot of stuff out there on the internet about the SR-71 and the mission and KC-135s, and here's just a few of them. And of course, you're not going to be able to write this down, and because that's a lot of stuff to try to write, and you probably get it wrong, and the URL won't work. So what I have is, I have these cards with my website on it, and the website has links to this presentation and links to these links. If you'd like to go sort of dive through them sometime. And there's things out there like the SR-71 Pilot's Manual that you could pull up and take a look at. It's all this stuff is declassified nowadays. So that's my website, charlesvono.com. And these are all the things I've done in my career, and most all of them have something to do with the Cold War. And certainly SR-71, my first assignment in the Air Force, had a lot to do with the Cold War. So I have a website I just mentioned, Cold War Lessons for the 21st Century, and this is the menu item where you scroll down and you can find these charts and those links. I also talk a lot about complex system sustainment management model in other presentations. Is there anybody here who has been working for an organization that tries to keep like a 10 or 20 or 30-year-old weapon system working? This is Hill Air Force Base, there's got to be a few. So I go around and talk to people on this subject, usually technical conferences. So I've got a degree from the Air Force Academy in 1976, spirit of 76. Master's in Systems Management, Mechanical Engineering from Utah State and Air University. My first assignment, KC-135 Aircraft Commander. Second assignment, I was the software systems chief for the inertial upper stage, which was a booster that the Air Force had put on the back of a shuttle or on top of a Titan 34D. And a lot of our missions were boosting super secret spy satellites, very heavy weight up into high orbits. So that was another Cold War mission. Here at the base as a reserve officer, I was the F-16 structural engineer, and our mission in wartime was to deploy with the F-16s and fix them out there in the forward operating locations and have the engineering sign-off authority signature that you could only really get at Hill, but if you're forward deployed, you can't wait for Hill, so they sent the engineers forward. They only did that once, and one second lieutenant went because, and he wound up laundry officer because they just weren't shooting these guys out of the sky. Nobody really could get a hold of them. And then my last assignment, full-time assignment in the Air Force, was working at Pacific Command for a combatant commander. 25 years experience with TRW Northrop Grumman sustaining intercontinental ballistic missiles, which of course is another Cold War activity. I don't know why they keep saying we won the Cold War. We still have our missiles, they still have their missiles. The Soviet Union's gone, but Russia's still there. So, a few other interests. I'm very active in the Utah engineer scene, if anybody wants to talk to me about that afterwards, or the fact that we did our first ever STEM Comic-Con booth this September, and that was a huge success. So if you want to talk about Comic-Con, we can do that. But this is for those people who really like to have an overview. Here's the 3-bullet overview, and I might follow this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Cold War because there's always a lot of young people in here who were born after the Cold War was over, or officially declared over. And then explanation of why we needed something like an SR-71, and then finally get into the KC-135 and the refueling mission and how all that worked. And of course, it's interesting. I find it technically interesting as an engineer to talk about this stuff, but the audience usually finds it more interesting when I talk to them about the times the technology didn't work and we had to figure out what to do then. That's me back in the 1960s thinking about someday I'd like to be an Air Force pilot. So this whole activity really starts, I like to say, post-World War II, when you're in this huge feeling of euphoria and life is good and the future is wonderful and great. And this particular poem is a really good example of the sort of sense of the future is wonderful and great and life is good that you felt after the war. I mean, you couldn't help but feel good after getting past the Great Depression and World War II. So, but really our story starts before World War II, back in the 1930s, with Army Air Corps officers who look back at the way we used aviation in World War I and the way we used aviation in the Civil War, and say to themselves, we're not using aviation very well at all to fight and win our wars, especially in this modern era of industrialized warfare. So we're coming up with a new plan. We know that we have to build bombers big enough to go over the front lines and strike at the industrial capability of our enemy. That's the way you use aircraft in war. And so by the end of World War II, not only was there euphoria about what a wonderful future we have, look at all this new wonderful technology we've developed, but there was also this nagging feeling that, if we could fly over a few oceans and go bomb the inner part of Germany, if we could fly across the whole Pacific and bomb Tokyo, they can do the same thing to us. Our oceans no longer protect us. And if anybody poo-pooed that, pretty soon Sputnik came along and flew right over us. So people, along with this euphoria, there was this sense of, there's something we need to do about this. But you'd find appliance ads for furniture talking about the push-button future. You'd find Bell Labs working on phones that could actually transmit an image during the phone call. This, I don't know if you can read it very well, but that's a nuclear-powered aircraft. They had a lot of great ideas. Fortunately, some of them they decided probably weren't that great an idea.
When I was a kid, pardon me, when I was a kid, everything was going nuclear.
Everything was
going to go nuclear.
You could buy seeds that were irradiated just to plant them and see what would come out. Yeah.
The friendly atom, they call it.
Yeah. You had to sell them refrigerators. You're going to sell refrigerators with the space age. And this is a 1960 Ford Starliner, which of course looks a lot like your jet aircraft that you're building right now. There's a guy in his G suit, his pressure suit. So this is the SR-71 era, 1957 and 1999. This is an early ICBM. And this is an early space program, X-15. And this, of course, is the proverbial computer as big as a room, the Whirlwind. It wasn't just a few years later that we took that amount of computing power and we shrunk it down to the size of what they then called a microcomputer and put it at the top of an ICBM and called that Minuteman II. It was also the same technology that got us, that size computer got us to the moon with Apollo. So that's the era we're talking about. And you remember the duck and cover exercises? So this is when I was a pilot in the Air Force, and it's so easy to forget some of these simple things, like you could work on your own car back then. You could pull out the carburetor and rebuild it, and change your spark plugs. Personal computers were coming out around 1981. In fact, I'll just tell you a little story because I feel like bragging and walking out of the field of view of the camera. This is, these are the charts in our KC-135. When I was flying the KC-135, you know, you'd use a pencil and you'd use these charts to figure out, you know, what speed you take off at, how much runway you've got left, all the things you need to know. You'd have a sheet about this big of information before you take off. In case something went wrong, you'd know instantly what to do because you'd ran all the numbers. So a friend of mine, Steve Brown, and I looked at that and we said, man, we got these things called computers now. We could just put all that in the computer. And so we demonstrated that to the commander of SAC, and we got everybody really interested. Of course, nowadays, people are carrying these little pads around with them to do, push a button, get your calculations. But back then, you know, we were on fire, and we convinced the leaders that computers were the next big thing. GPS satellites. How did we fly our tankers from Beale to, say, Okinawa? Well, we used a sextant. You take that sextant, you push it up through the top of the cockpit, and you would take a sighting on the stars, and you had to be very skilled so that you would actually arrive at Okinawa and not Red China, because Red China wouldn't like the greatest. So, first space shuttle flight was 1981. I don't know if any of you remember, but those space shuttles, when they flew back then, they were frequently going into blackout regions where they had no communications at all. They were launching Tigrises early on to try to bridge that gap, and now we've got worldwide communications. You wait till, what was it, after 6 or 7 to make your long-distance phone calls, and they were still pretty expensive. When I went to Bakersfield Junior College, we could get on a phone line and call down to Cal Poly and get onto their computer. That's enough of that chart. Anybody recognize this picture? This gets us back to the history of the Cold War. 1960. The fellow in the dock is Francis Gary Powers. So a lot of people don't know or realize that right after World War II, when the Soviets were very interested in developing nuclear weapons, atomic bombs, ICBMs, being able to carry bombs on bombers across oceans, we were very interested in keeping an eye on them. And we would fly RF-80s out of Japan, a very hush-hush classified program. That was a very, very dangerous thing to do. They just basically told the pilot, you know, if it looks like you could sneak over the border and take a look, do it, but get back here because they can shoot you down real easy. So they developed a U-2 that flew really, really high, up above 50,000 feet, and the CIA flew a lot of these. Francis Gary Powers was a CIA pilot. And that worked really well until the Soviets figured out how to knock them out of the sky using missiles. Francis Gary Powers, by the way, a very interesting story of the Cold War is that, of course, he was tried and convicted. He spent almost 2 years in jail in Russia before we did a swap for some Soviet spies and got him back. And he flew for about 10 years as a test pilot, and then he flew, what was it, KTLA, traffic and weather helicopter around LA, and finally he wound up dying in a helicopter crash in 1977. This guy had a very interesting life.
Can I add to that?
Yes?
Khrushchev actually sent his family a condolence card.
Really? I had not heard that.
Yeah.
Say that again?
Khrushchev actually sent his family a condolence card when he was killed.
Khrushchev sent his family a condolence card, that's really Okay, so that's the U-2, and Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works down there at Palmdale out in the desert built this to get up above 50,000 feet. Of course, if you're above 50,000 feet, you're really outside of most of the atmosphere, and you have to wear a spacesuit. So U-2 pilots wear spacesuits, just like SR-71 pilots. Once when Kelly Johnson was asked, how did you come up with the idea of the U-2? He said, well, it's just a highly modified F-104. I think highly modified is the key word. But they could shoot down our U-2s, so we really needed a spy plane that could outrun the missiles, which this aircraft has outrun missiles, I'd say a handful of times in its career. I had the opportunity to actually be on one of the missions where they outran a missile over near the, we were flying out of Okinawa, so the mission was up over the eastern part of Russia, or the Soviet Union at that time. And they actually fired off a missile at them, and they said, oh look, you see the radar track? And they were showing it to us. It was interesting. But, so this is the airplane we're going to talk about today. And this is the era. The A-12, which is now, was already in work when Francis Gary Powers was shot down. We actually started flying SR-71s in regular strategic reconnaissance missions starting in 1964. The bases that I'm most familiar with from my time, from 77 to 82, was Beale Air Force Base. I was assigned to Beale. SR-71s are assigned there. The tankers at Refueling are assigned there. And it seemed as though the thing about being assigned to Beale was that was for sure the place you knew you weren't going to be, because you'd fly worldwide, and you'd have forward operating locations out of Kadena in Okinawa, and RAF Mildenhall in the UK. Now, Kadena, when I first started going there in 77, was still under US control. In 1977, in July, it was transferred back to the Japanese, which the Okinawans didn't care for too much. But that was a very interesting transition, if only for the fact that you're suddenly going from driving on the right side of the road to driving on the left side of the road. RAF Mildenhall in the UK is home of the Tanker Task Force. So when we would fly over to there, we would draw a lot of missions supporting, say, F-4s out of Germany, things like that. But we also brought our Qs over, and we would have SR-71 missions on occasion. And that RAF Mildenhall was the forward operating base where I had the opportunity to commandeer a security police car one day, because there was SR-71 emergency and they needed my crew out of the plane immediately. And so I just grabbed the first security police car I found and said, I need to commandeer your car, and we need to get our crew out to the aircraft. And our Air Force security policeman was like, great, this is wonderful. His day was pretty boring until you came along. So it doesn't really have a fantastic ending to the story. I mean, the fact is, we ran around RAF Mildenhall, gathered up the crew, got to the aircraft, was starting our engines just when the SR-71 successfully landed. And we were there in case he did not successfully land and had to go around and had to get some fuel before he could try again. So we were there just in case, and we didn't actually get to do the in case. Although there was one in Okinawa where we were air refueling in a thunderstorm in the traffic pattern because the SR-71 was out of fuel and couldn't get his gear down, and we saved that SR, so that was nice. We also landed with fuel gauge, with gauge error on our fuel tanks, which got us in trouble with the base commander, but we rescued the SR. This is a little graphic that shows starting in 1903 with the first controlled manned aircraft and how fast they could go, all the way up to the top speed record held currently by the SR-71, and it's hard to believe that it will ever be held by anybody else ever again, because anything we build after this is probably going to be unmanned or hypersonic space vehicle. But here's some comparisons to some other vehicles going about that speed. Wouldn't you like to go from LA to New York in 68 minutes? So there's a lot of backup charts that you can find at my website that talks more about that and gives you the list of all of the different speed records. This is the chart that again talks about speed, but it answers the question. Somebody told me SR-71 can go as fast as a rifle bullet. Is that true? And the answer is true. 338 Winchester Magnum, actually, to be precise. This is an interesting chart for those of you interested in avionics, the aircraft. This is pressure altitude. So when you get up above about 18,000 feet, you stop talking about altitude and you start talking about flight levels. So if you're flying at flight level 33, then you're at about 33,000 feet pressure altitude. You basically have a barometer type instrument in your aircraft that makes sure that everybody is flying at the same flight level. And so that's why that's just basically height. Pressure altitude is basically height. This is true airspeed, which is basically how fast you're going through the air. And you notice these little lines here that get vertically straight and then they curve a little bit down here closer to the ground. Those are Mach numbers. So if you look for Mach 3.3 and about 65,000 feet, which is about the SR-71, then you can find what your airspeed is, and about 1,800 knots, which is about 3,000 feet per second. The reason I went through all of that is to tell you that this is the absolute top, fastest speed a tanker can fly at. And so you see there's a little bit of a gap that we have to cover if he's going to come down and slow down enough to get refueled. Basically what you'll see is that the tanker is flying as fast as it can. It looks almost like it's got a negative angle of attack because it's going so fast. And that SR-71, I need two hands for this, is flying at such a low speed that it's got a very high angle of attack. And then as you're refueling, the tanker is offloading its fuel. It can go a little faster, and the SR is receiving its fuel, and it has to go a little faster. So you start off as fast as you can, and you continue to go as fast as you can, and your speed increases. Sometimes, like say in the Pacific, when the air is just too warm, you can't maintain an altitude and do that maneuver. So you have to actually lose altitude, and that's called a toboggan. And the SR isn't the only receiver that requires a toboggan sometimes. So, back to speed. Built the SR-71 to outrun any missile. And so these are the kinds of temperatures that it heats up to. And just to give you some perspective on these temperatures, a jet engine nozzle is like around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. But normal jet fuel, JP4, JP5, JP8, it's going to auto-combust, just explode at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. So the Palmdale Skunk Works engineers were smart enough to figure out how to build this aircraft, but one of the big problems they had to tackle was how are we going to fuel it. So they came up with a fuel called JP7, which basically has an indefinite auto-ignite temperature. In fact, I'll tell you a little story. We carry JP4 in the wing tanks of the KC-135Q. We carried JP7 in the body tanks. And one day we had a piece of ground equipment that got mishandled by a young 19-year-old maintenance guy and rammed it into the front end of the tanker, actually started a tire fire and a hydraulic fire in the nose gear of the tanker. And that burned for a little while, weakened the structure so much that it tore open the forward fuel tank, spilled a JP7 all over the fire and put it out. So that's JP7. That is very, very difficult to light. This is a picture looking up the back end of an SR-71. And that green glow is TEB. And you had to eject TEB into the engines while they were being turned with a couple of Buick Wildcat engines. And then that would get you the heat and the ignition to throw the JP7 in there and start the engine. Now, these engines, these are state-of-the-art, well beyond state-of-the-art engines, and they would frequently have issues in flight, unstarting or dying on them. And they'd have to carry TEB with them, actually in the aircraft, with a little switch where they could squirt a little TEB in there to try to restart an engine so they wouldn't have to just eject. We used to carry, yeah, there it is, 16 uses. We used to carry little barrels of that TEB with us, and its chemical characteristics are it explodes on contact with the atmosphere. And so if you can imagine the safety issues of carrying a can of this stuff in the back of your KC-135, it never felt good. We have had accidents. The worst one that I know about personally is when we were unloading it and the lid got a little bit loose and blew one of our airmen's heads clean off. So very, very dangerous chemical. These are where the fuel tanks are located on the SR-71. And a lot of the pictures you'll see this sort of characteristic. Well, I think I mentioned earlier about, maybe I was telling you gentlemen about my classic memory is sitting as lead in my 3-ship tanker formation, waiting at the end of the runway, watching as the SR taxis out to go take off, dripping fuel the whole way, because they just couldn't figure out a way to seal these tanks. The entire aircraft is built of titanium because of the heat, and it withstands the heat, but titanium has a really terrible coefficient of thermal expansion. So when it's up at speed, it's stretched out and all those gaps are filled in and the fuel is not leaking. When it's down on the ground and it's cool, it's much shorter and there's plenty of room for that fuel to leak. In fact, it was a presentation like this where one of the maintenance guys talked about, hey, you know, we tried this sealant and that sealant, we tried this and that, and some of them would work for maybe 2 missions before they'd wear out. And so they were constantly trying to come up with the sealant, but they never did come up with a great sealant. There's another picture, see where it's kind of, see the fuel leaking there as the gear coming up. And some stats on how many pounds of fuel the SR can hold. This is the picture that, anybody notice something a little bit different about this SR-71?
That's like the one that's out on this parking lot.
Exactly.
It's got the raised canopy in the rear.
For the instructor pilot.
Oh, I didn't never knew what that was.
So you got to, even SR-71 pilots have a point in time where they don't know how to fly it, and they're taught how to fly it. But you can see here, they're just pulling back from the tanker because you can see the fuel leaking out the top of the wing. That was one of the ways we knew that, well, what we'd like to do and what the SR pilots wanted to do is they wanted to not call for a disconnect when they got the amount of fuel they ordered up. They wanted to do what's called a pressure disconnect. A pressure disconnect is when the automatic system overrides and disconnects the boom because you've got just the last amount that you can possibly hold, and so the pressure pushes the boom away. And when you do that, you can tell you're getting real close because you can actually see the fuel leaking out the top. And then seconds later, there's a pressure disconnect.
One moment on that photo. When they brought this one that's out in the parking lot, I was part of that crew.
One out in the hangar?
That's right, yeah, in the hangar. Notice the outboard wings, outboard of the engine. You can cut those off, and that airplane is intact with the engines on it, will fit inside the cargo plane.
Oh.
Yeah, and they flew it here from Beale. And then we bolted the wings back on it with number 10 bolts. It'll never fly again, of course, so that's acceptable.
Well, if you look on the internet, different SR-71 pilots talking about what it's like to fly this aircraft, they say every different aircraft has a different feel to it, and a single aircraft has a different feel from flight to flight because of that expansion and contraction of the titanium. The whole aircraft can actually grow a whole foot at top speed. This is afterburner, just right at takeoff. And when I was a tanker pilot at Beale, Tuesday nights was the night that they would do night flying training. And so I go out in my backyard, which was kind of up in the hillside overlooking the runway, and I could watch about 7 miles down on the runway as the SR-71 would take off, and you could see these standing waves actually bounce off of the runway and up and still maintain their standing waves and take off straight up. And I knew exactly what was going on. Heck, it was my mission, but it's every time looked like a UFO to me. So I don't fault anybody who thought that was a UFO. So back to the picture we started with. The special tactics, special tankers needed for this high flashpoint fuel. One of the things I might point out here, which I haven't really done that much before, is see, that's the window that the boom operator looks out. He's laying with his face here and his feet here, and he's got a joystick, and he's, you know, I'm saying he because back when I was doing this, they were all he's, but now they're she's. Flying the boom down, and you can see that the boom is extended into the green area, and if it extends further, there'll be a yellow and orange. So he's right in the sweet spot there. Fact is, as a co-pilot in KC-135Q Squadron, one of my assignments was to be the on-base buddy for the first KC-135 tanker female pilot, which was interesting because the thing about the female pilots coming in at that time was everybody thought one of two things. She's a female, so she couldn't possibly be a good pilot, or she's a female, she must be the best pilot ever. And the reality is, nobody's the best pilot ever, every day. Everybody's got good days and bad days, and everybody's kind of there in the normal curve. And so there were a lot of people who just couldn't stand the fact that she was just a normal pilot. So, KC-135, modified to carry the JP-7 fuel, segregates the fuel, like I mentioned earlier, has 2 ground refueling ports. If you go out, when you drove into the museum today, you drove off that main road and saw your first airplane, that was a KC-135. It's got the new engines on it, but it's basically the same airframe. If you go up into the wheel well, on the, I think the right-hand side, you'll find this big port where you put the fuel in and fill it up with JP5 nowadays, JP8. Back then it was JP4. With the Q bottle tanker, you can go over to the other wheel well, find a similar port, and that's where you put in the JP7. So it also had strobe lights, had special comm. Nowadays, all tankers have a boom interphone to where when you hook up with the pilot, you can talk over the interphone system through a wire in the boom. Qs were the only ones that had it at that time because we were flying these super secret radio silent missions that it's nice once you hook up to be able to talk to each other and coordinate things like, we're in the middle of a thunderstorm, let's turn right and get the hell out of here. And that happened far too often. I mean, it's a radio silent mission. You had to be there at precisely the right place at precisely the right time. And if there happened to be a huge thunderstorm there, well, you couldn't call the guy to say, we're moving things over 5 miles. You just had to meet up with him there and then get out of there. Special crew training for formation. And I guess I included the words take command because I knew a lot of my fellow aircraft commanders and navigators from this mission. Later, when I had that tour of duty at PACOM, and I ran into a lot of my old buddies from the SR-71 days who had stayed in and had really great careers. And I myself, being back and forth in the reserves, made it all the way to full colonel. And I ran across one of my friends in the Pentagon who had just completed a paper that talked about the fact that an inordinate number of people who had been in this mission at this time period made full colonel. And they attributed that to the fact that young people were given a lot of responsibility early on. You were given the mission, radio silent, just make it work. And this was 1977, so the Vietnam War was over. There really were no other operational missions besides reconnaissance going on. So this is the formation geometry that we would fly with the tankers, either 2 or 3 tankers. And most every mission that you flew, you most likely could offload all the fuel that this SR needed off of one tanker. But the problem with that is that this tanker would probably have to land immediately at the nearest base. And usually the nearest base was not Hill Air Force Base. So actually the more economical thing to do would be to fly in 2 or 3 ship formations. First of all, because the tankers could return home. But second, if this tanker couldn't offload, well, this one surely could. And if he couldn't, he surely could. And so you don't risk the mission by having a single point of failure. Now, when you have that many airplanes that close to each other in the sky, it gets really chancy and nervous. It's really easy, far easier than you think, to run into each other, especially in an aerial refueling. If you imagine an aerial refueling where you're coming up like this behind this aircraft, just the aerodynamics, the physics of the air at that point in time means that the air wants to suck you together and crash you into each other. And so you have to be very, very alert to where you are next to this aircraft. And if you've got a couple more over here, that just makes it even more complicated. And when you're done with this guy and you're going to refuel here, you know, you moved over here, keep an eye on him, keep an eye on him, and he's going to move over here. Just, I've got a lot of moving parts in the air that can so very easily crash into each other. So they modified what you might imagine as the old World War II formations, where you would have these diamonds in the sky where you're covering each other with your machine guns to protect the bombers. Well, we weren't trying to protect each other, so we flew line abreast, almost line abreast, 85 degrees, so that SR-71 pilot, wearing his spacesuit with a visor this big, looking out a window this big, could still keep an eye on all these aircraft and have some confidence that we were all going to run into each other and kill each other. And we would stay separated by altitude also. The J-57 engines could produce 10,000 pounds thrust dry and 13,000 pounds thrust wet. We injected water into these J-57 engines to get off the ground. Now they've got the modern new engines. If you go out to the tanker out there today, it's got the big turbofan engines. But these were post-World War II J-57 engines. And in order to carry a reasonable amount of fuel on a 2-mile runway, you needed to inject them with water to get that extra thrust to get off the ground. But the mission is still the same on any tanker nowadays. You measure the length of the runway to figure out how much fuel to put on board the aircraft. And so, every aircraft takeoff with the tanker is an exciting one. One of the most exciting takeoffs is at Anderson Air Force Base in Guam, where the runway is just a little bit hilly and ends in a cliff. And by the time you get to the end of that runway, you've actually rotated and taken off, but you're still in ground effect. You've got that pressure of the air underneath your wings that gives you a little bit of extra lift. And then that goes away when you go over the cliff, and that aircraft kind of mushes down until it hits the ocean and goes back up. So that's one of the more exciting takeoffs. This is today's KC-135R, which I keep mentioning. Now the KC-135Qs that I keep talking about, when they were modified to the new engines, they were called KC-135Ts. So they still have those Q model capabilities of segregating fuel and things like that. I mentioned here these wings are reinforced and they don't crack as much. When I was flying KC-135s, what time is it, by the way? I don't have a watch.
140.
Oh, I better start wrapping things up. So when I was flying tankers, we had this little yellow light in the cockpit. They had acoustic sensors throughout the wings because they were aging and getting cracks, and they couldn't get them all through depot to replace them all, so they ran them all through depot real fast to put a little wing crack detector light. If that little light came on, you could reset it once, and then if it came on again, the tech order said, fly home very carefully, because your wing is definitely cracking. So, just some Tanker 101 information about how important they are. You know, we flew over to the RAF Mildenhall to support the European Tanker Task Force. Very often we would meet up with a 4-ship of F-4s to drag them across the Atlantic. And so we would be, we'd have our KC-135Q aircraft, but we'd fill it with JP-4. And we would refuel F-4s on the way over. And usually North Atlantic, miserable weather, you're in the clouds, you can't see anything. And those F-4s, they don't want to lose their flying gas station, and so they kind of tuck right up underneath your wings. Well, one of those missions we were flying one day, we suddenly had every attitude indicator. We're in the soup, we can't see anything, no horizon. All of our attitude control instruments in the cockpit suddenly reported as bad. And so you're thinking, it's got to be a problem, I hope, with the indicator system and not actually the attitude, but you can't bet your life on that. So we call the lead F4 and say, you are now our primary attitude control instrument. You need to keep an eye on us, and keep an eye on that little ball in the cockpit, because we might just go over into the drink if you don't. So to make a long story short, this was early days. I was a brand new co-pilot. My aircraft commander was screaming at me to figure out what the hell was wrong. And one of the wonderful things about flying in a tanker is you can bring the entire Dash 1 with you and look things up if you have to, because I had never heard anything like this before. And after a couple of minutes of sweat pouring off my head and trying to think of what's going on, I say, this doesn't happen. I don't know what's going on. He turns over to me and screams even louder. He says, "Get creative!" So that was, you know, very good motivation for me to get creative and start looking up where the circuit breakers were. And it turned out there was a whole panel of circuit breakers that had got right behind the aircraft commander's seat that had gotten hit by a piece of circuit breaker recovery hardware that had popped them all simultaneously. So it was kind of like, this wiring diagram says, oh, none of these have anything in common except, oh, they're all on the same circuit breaker panel in a row. Where is that circuit breaker panel? Oh, it's right there. So I got creative.
You got a medal for that?
No. Lack of being yelled at is your medal. So this is the inside of the tanker cockpit. I thought I would show this because this is the fuel panel. You have 10 tanks of fuel. And another thing that the co-pilot does is he keeps track of all this fuel so that you don't wind up being so out of balance in your CG that you fall out of the sky. You have to keep an eye on your center of gravity. And all of these valves here help you move the fuel to the right places. So, they make it simple for us pilots. These things that look like a wing are the tanks that are in the wing, and these things that look like a body are the tanks that are in the body. So. And these are the engine number 1, engine number 2, engine number 3, engine number 4, and the different instruments that you follow there. Landing gear, of course. Pilot and co-pilot both have instruments that show you. And this is what the attitude control looked like that day with the F4s. All the warning flags were out. And compass, and these little T-handles there were to pull out to in case you got an engine fire. So once you get used to it, the cockpit really isn't all that confusing. That's to blow up the fuel panel. And that's where the fuel is located. And some statistics for folks that would like to memorize statistics. You recognize the superhero in that picture? He's the arrow. And the reason I used him there is because it's the arrow that helps remind us how to fly aircraft. If you have an arrow, you have a heavy point at the front, and you have feathers at the back. You need to have your center of gravity ahead of your center of aerodynamics. And so that's what you do with the tanker. You make sure that your center of gravity is forward enough so that you maintain flyability. With the aircraft, modern aircraft like F-16s, they move that center of gravity so far back that the only way that they can keep that aircraft stable is with onboard computers and control systems between the pilot and the control surfaces. This is the standard air refueling rendezvous. So I think I mentioned earlier about the SR-71 is coming in very fast. We are coming in trying to make sure we get to a particular point at a particular time so that he pulls up right behind us to refuel. But fortunately, the Air Force issued me a navigator to help me tell me, after I've been drilling holes in the sky here, when exactly, how far to go here and when to turn so that when I roll out, my receiver is behind me. Nowadays, they don't have navigators, they have computers. A little bit about air refueling tracks. Angle of attack. I do want to show this before we go into questions. This is the angle of attack I mentioned earlier, where the SR is going very slow, tanker's going very fast. This is from towards the end of the century, SR-71 refueling. This is towards the beginning of the program, SR-71 aerial refueling. Aerodynamics don't change. And this is a whole list of things that, stories I could tell you if you want, or this is a good time for Q&A. Anybody would like to ask questions or bring up their own stories or have inputs, or if you don't, I'll tell a few stories.
Let's go.
Okay, so let's see. I suppose one of my favorites is when I was an aircraft commander, when I was a co-pilot, taking my check rides to move to the left seat, become an aircraft commander. So I'm sitting in the left seat, you know, fake it till you make it, pretend to be the aircraft commander, trying to do a good job and impress the instructor pilot on the right, who also happens to be the commander of my squadron. So I'm a captain and he's my colonel boss and he's evaluating me. As we're coming in on short final, maybe 2 miles away from the numbers, we look down and there is a bolt of lightning that comes up from the ground and hits me right in the nose. Well, it's the nose of the aircraft, but it feels like it's your nose when you're flying the aircraft. And so, you know, I land the air, instead of doing a touch and go and what we were planning to do, you know, land the aircraft, pull it in, have it looked at, and you know, I looked over at my boss and they said, I guess we're done for the day. No, we're not. We'll just get it looked at and we'll take off again. So, okay. Didn't pass that. So they couldn't find anything wrong with the nose of the aircraft, anything wrong with the aircraft. The aircraft's built to withstand a lot of lightning strikes. So we get back up, we fly around. And I have future flights with this guy. I eventually become the aircraft commander and all that stuff. But when I go home that night, coming through the front door, my wife Nita meets me there, and she looks at me and she says, how come your hair's so gray? Nothing, I just got hit by lightning. I think of why that would do it. So that's the story of that one, that she actually did decide that that was the day my hair turned gray, and she had no idea that it was also the day I got struck by lightning while trying to impress the boss.
It's 1:50, you got 10 minutes.
Okay, well, we have St. Elmo's Fire. Y'all have heard, probably, you all read Moby Dick, right? So you know what St. Elmo's Fire is. It's in Moby Dick, they talk about how it lights up the masts on these ships that are sailing across the ocean trying to find whales. In aircraft, there are little blue sparkles that show up on your windscreen, especially if you're in the Pacific. It's sort of moist, warm conditions. And so you can get into a situation where you get so much this static St. Elmo's Fire that it can cover up the entire windscreen and make you blind, but that's really not that big a deal. I mean, you've got your instruments, you've got your radar. Well, this particular story comes from a friend of mine. This did not happen to me directly, but he had such a huge amount of St. Elmo's Fire that it covered the entire aircraft while he was air refueling an SR-71 in the Pacific, it went down the boom and started to cover the SR. Now remember that SR-71 pilot is wearing a spacesuit, looking out a little window like this. So he has very little tolerance for not being able to see out that window because he doesn't want to run into another airplane, right? We talked about that. So as soon as that St. Elmo's fire comes down and starts surrounding his aircraft, he's got almost as much fuel as he thinks he needs, certainly as much as he wants at that point in time. So he calls a disconnect, and he's ready to go on his way while he can still see out his window. But the St. Elmo's fire decides that it does not need to disconnect. And it stays connected for about 75 feet before it snaps with a huge noise. But again, not to worry, it's JP7, it's not going to blow up. I talked about the fighter drags across the pond. There's plenty of stories of my fellow tanker pilots hearing from their receivers. Now, since I wasn't attached to a B-52 outfit, I got all sorts of missions, like C-130s. They even got missions out of Area 51. But so you hear about a lot of these stories about receivers that are coming in and they're calling on the radio and they're saying, okay, we're in pre-contact, and the boom operator is saying, pilot boom, I don't see any airplane behind us. And so that's the point where you call the guy up and you say, okay, look on the side of my airplane, how many windows can you count? Because you're not behind us. So many times when the aircraft would pull up behind an airliner, thinking they're going to get fuel, but you know, count the number of windows, wait for the boom. That's not us. We're over here. Breakaway is a good story. I talked about the fact that airplanes like to slam into each other if they're close together. So we had a special procedure, and we still do, called breakaway. And if you have an instance where you see like the aircraft is getting too close for comfort, either aircraft can call breakaway, breakaway, breakaway. And the procedure is, when you first hear that word breakaway, the receiver has to throw his throttles back and push down on the stick. There's no point in time after you hear the word breakaway where you say, wait a minute, let's talk about this. No, if you hear the word breakaway, you do it, you talk about it later. So you, as a receiver, you throw your throttles back and you push down with the stick to get away from the tanker. The tanker throws his throttles forward, which if you're refueling an SR, there isn't a lot more to give there. But, and do you pull up? No, you hold wings level. Because if you pull up with the tanker, you're not really pulling up, you're dropping your tail. And the last thing you want to do is drop your tail on the guy who's trying to get away from you. So that's a breakaway.
Let's talk about ejections. Do you do that out of the SR?
SR-71 has ejection seats. It has some very famous ejections that it's had that where people have survived and some where they have not. There was at least one instance where the pilot found himself ejecting without, he swears, without ever having touched the handles because the breakup of the aircraft was so catastrophic that it kind of threw him out of the airplane. But I don't know, I'll leave that up to the engineers to say if that's possible. With a tanker, you have a bailout capability if you choose to use it, and it's been used in some certain rare instances. You basically, you put on your helmet, you put on your parachute, and there's a crew access door that you can pull. It's just right behind the aircraft commander. And you can pull this lever, and a guillotine drops and blows open the door, and the guillotine serves as a kind of air shield. So you can drop far enough so that you're out of the way of the wheels if you happen to have your wheels down. And talking to the people who have successfully done that with the wheels down, they said they could read Goodyear on the tires as they blew by. It actually does work. The thing that would happen very often with tankers, though, is that they would just blow up, and you don't have time to do anything, they just blow up. The center wing tank especially was notorious for having an issue with the fuel system where it could initiate a spark in an almost empty tank, and it's right in the center of the aircraft. So that was something that, at least in one case, there was an issue with the way they had repaired the tank. In another case, they had parts they had to change to make them less sparkable. But, you know, flying aircraft back in those days, you had several friends you knew who died from flying. And nowadays, thankfully, things are a lot safer.
Did you ever refuel AWACS?
No. Somebody asked me that the other day. Did you ask me that the other day? Somebody did. Yeah, AWACS is very interesting, but the most interesting one in terms of aerodynamics is the C5, because the C5, when it's coming up into pre-contact and then contact, is pushing your tail with its bow wave. And you're having to, I've heard that some tanker pilots like to do everything with autopilot. I always thought that was stupid. You have to be able to train yourself to give the receiver a steady, very stable platform to take fuel, even if your autopilot's not working. So why in the world would you ever use your autopilot? Except for your rudder, you want to keep that. But so you just get, you learn the feel of that C5 pushing your tail up. I'm sorry, you had a question.
When you're refueling like a smaller fighter aircraft, are you hooked pretty solid? Is there a lot of flexibility? Or?
Well, both aircraft are trying to be very stable with regards to each other because of the issue with aerodynamics. But you can get, my worst experience was the C-130, where as a brand new student C-130 pilot trying to learn how to air refuel, and he got into one of these figure eights back here where my boom operator said, I think he's trying to chop off our boom with those propellers. And sometimes the student is having a really, really bad day, and you have to just say, we're not going to do this anymore. Let's just go home.
Is the SR ever been a
behind you?
Well, I was just wondering, since you guys were on blackout with your radio emissions and everything, you're not emitting anything, have you ever on one of those refueling missions been hooked up and all of a sudden had an unwanted visitor? You had to...
Well, I could talk to you about a couple of security issues that were typical, and you could tell me if I answered your question. Whenever we flew out over near Okinawa, we fly out of Kadena, we do refuelings with the SR because he wanted to look at, well, there's countries there, Russia and China. The typical sort of banter that goes on in the tanker cockpit, the pilot says, the navigator turns to the pilot and says, okay, we should be there right now. You should start your racetrack turns now. You're right at the initial point for the refueling. And the pilot looks out the window, sees the Russian trawler out in the Pacific and says, yep, we're there. And all these air refueling tracks and times and dates and locations are all supposedly secret. So,
I was thinking more
I
like
got another story.
Okay.
But I think all they did was they call up the flight kitchen and ask them, who's getting lunches today, what time. The other security issue was, this is very typical for flying from Beale across the United States to look at Cuba. We would do all that radio silent. How do you do that radio silent when you have air traffic control and you have all these airliners and everything? Well, you're actually talking to air traffic control, and you say, air traffic control, we're Project Silverplate, or whatever. Some code word for the operation. And supposedly the air traffic controller goes over to his book, opens the book for Project Silverplate, and goes, this guy's a super secret mission. I shouldn't say anything. But inevitably they go back, key the mic, and says, oh, you guys are the tankers with the SR. So I've got a couple more, but is that anywhere near what you're looking for?
Well, I'm just, you're off the coast of Russia, China, North Korea. They're going to run unannounced combat air patrols or whatever, and I just... Oh,
would they intercept the tanker?
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got threat receivers,
We're pretty far away from the hot areas, but, there's RC-135s, there's bombers that do practice runs towards Russia. They get intercepted regularly. Every once in a while you'll see a story in the paper about Russia intercepts our aircraft. Yeah, they do that to practice. I mean, they've been doing that for decades. So what makes this particular interception you're writing about today different? The guy who wrote the story has no idea. He just is saying, this happened today, wow, isn't this something? I don't know why it's something today and it wasn't something yesterday. Maybe just because you found out.
When you're offloading fuel and everything, it's quite obvious you get lighter, the other airplane gets heavier. Does that pose a problem?
Well, in the SR-71 refueling, it's of course, we depend upon that to be able to go faster. And for the SR to be able to go faster to keep up with the extra fuel intake, it's part of the process. Where it becomes interesting is, there's a couple of stories on that. One is, when you have a lot of fuel in the tanker, let me just say that a tanker dry is about 110,000 pounds. Tanker with fuel is close to 300,000 pounds. So we're talking, triple your weight when you're loaded with fuel. So all of that fuel means that you have a lot of inertia. And if, say, you were flying in the traffic pattern or somewhere where you're having to do very controlled things like landing or takeoff or joining up with another aircraft, when you've got more fuel, you definitely feel that inertia. You pull off the thrust, you're still going real fast, but it's going to take a while to slow down, right? Mm-hmm. But if you are almost empty, it's a little bit more responsive. In fact, you can't land just because of the capabilities of the brakes on the landing gear and other things on the landing gear. You can't land full. If you take off and you have a big enough emergency that you've got to land immediately, then you've got to flip some switches on that fuel control panel and dump all your fuel to be able to land. Something else I was going to say about that. Oh, when I was flying as a co-pilot in tankers, I would fly, I'd say, there might be a day where I would fly a T-38 in the morning and a tanker in the afternoon. Now that's really different because a T-38 is a little supersonic sports car jet, right? As soon as you're thinking about it, it's going where you want it to go. And when you fly in a tanker, it's, okay, now we're going. So that you develop sort of this wide set of skills. You definitely have to remember when you're landing that you don't flare high in the T-38 because you still have like 2 stories beneath you before you hit the runway. And you don't flare late in the tanker because I did that once. That was really painful. You have to remember when to flare and land softly.
Will the SR ever fly again? I understand NASA's got at least one.
Yeah, I don't think the one NASA has is still flyable at this point, but I knew that earlier, like maybe 10 years ago, I thought they had a flyable one. That would be a good thing to Google, look up and see if they still got one flying. It's just really, really expensive, and solutions nowadays really seem to rotate around things like Global Hawk, unmanned aircraft. We still have U-2s flying.
Do we have anything to replace the SR-71?
Well, there's always a lot of speculation.
That's what
Being a retired Northrop Grumman guy, I'd say, well, it's obviously the Global Hawk. But, they're talking about, Lockheed has been making noises lately about producing something they're calling an SR-72, which I think is going to be an unmanned version. And
The Aurora.
the Aurora was what they had talked about 30 years ago, back when they first retired the SR. Retired once, they came back, and then retired again. And one of the things about that retirement, the initial retirement had a lot to do with the fact that in order to get most of the intelligence you wanted from it, it had to land, you had to pull stuff off. In its second incarnation, it had a lot more downlink capability. But even at that, it was too expensive. I mean, you're not talking about just maintaining that fleet of SR-71, but also that even bigger fleet of tankers to support them, and all the maintenance and all the repair. Are we close to the hour? Should we be?
5 after 2.
If again, if you want to leave, I will in no way be upset if you just get up and leave. And if you have more questions,
Just wanted to thank you for the presentation. It was good for the young men to get an appreciation of all the thought that goes behind what you have to do versus the video game application that's that you see today.
That's the future of aviation, is video games.
But it still was good to see hear your perspective.
Be happy to chat with anybody afterwards. I'll be here for as long as you want. You had a question?
Oh, did you already talk about trying to refuel behind an airliner?
Yeah.
You did talk about that, okay.
Yeah.
So let's just call it a day. They come up here, we could chat.
Thank you.